Shamima Begum left Britain as a schoolgirl to join the terrorists of Dayesh in Syria. As a result, the British government cancelled her citizenship and told her never to return. So exactly who is responsible for bringing her to account? And is cancelling someone's citizenship ever acceptable? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Shamima Begum was just 15 years old when she travelled to Syria with two school friends to join Daesh. 4 years later, she was discovered in a sorry state in a North Syrian refugee camp where she told a journalist she wanted to return home to the UK. But instead, the UK cancelled her British citizenship, and despite initially winning an appeal, the Special Immigrations Appeal Commission has now upheld the decision to leave Shamima Begum stateless. Is that what she deserves? And who is responsible for dealing with people who turn to terrorism? So let's meet today's guests. In the studio, we have Rebecca Butler, who's a barrister with an interest in Shamima Begum's case. Meanwhile, joining us from Surrey, we have journalist and documentary filmmaker Drury. He's interviewed Shamima Begum over the course of a year and a half. And in London, we have Yasmine Ahmed. She is the UK Director of Human Rights Watch. If I can start off, Rebecca, with you. Thank you very much for joining me here today. How would you characterise this case? Would you regard it as reasonable, the actions that have been taken by the UK government, or unreasonable?
Well, the court has determined that it's not unreasonable in the legal sense of the word. And the question that the courts have dealt with is how, to what extent the Home Secretary has exercised his powers. It was Sajid Javid at the time, and they have confirmed that he properly exercised those powers. It's had a transition through the Special Immigrations Appeal Commission, through the Court of Appeal, who actually found for Shamima Begum, up to the Supreme Court that reversed that decision, and the most recent judgment is back in the Special Immigration Appeals Commission.
Yasmine, let me cross over to you, if I may. How do you feel about this decision?
Well, I mean, it's very worrying. I think, as the previous guest has noted, to some degree, the Commission who decided this decision had their hands tied by virtue of the decision by the Supreme Court. But it is nonetheless extremely disappointing, because essentially what it says at the end of the day is that the Secretary of State at the time, Sajid Javid, could essentially strip the citizenship of a girl who was a minor at the time. She was very likely groomed and trafficked to northeast Syria, and she was trafficked and groomed for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Now, the fact that it's lawful to deprive someone like that, who is principally, from that perspective, a victim of their citizenship, which is really what we call a gateway right, because without the right to citizenship, so many rights are unattainable. And it now leaves her in a situation where she's de facto stateless. She's unable to go to Bangladesh, and she's sitting in a camp, indefinitely detained, in conditions that have been found to amount to cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment.
Andrew, if I can come across to you, because you actually have met Shamima Begum and filmed her over a series of, I think it's about 18 months that you were interviewing her over. Describe that to me and describe what that experience was like.
It's been, as I say, I've interviewed her on 7 occasions. She changed. From the first time I met her, she was really apologetic. She seemed to the understanding that she joined ISIS and she understood what it stood for. And by the last meeting I had with her, she was totally non-apologetic and had this victim she seemed to be playing out. So she's changed so much over the year and a half period I've been with her.
So you were actually quite sympathetic to her position when you began your documentary filming. How did your opinion evolve, or does it remain the same to this day?
No, it's changed. I kind of, when I first met her, she looked like a frightened child, very immature, she seemed, and kind of scared of her outcome. It changed over a period of time through a network and series of lies that she would tell, that she would change her story every time. And I think I had a text message from her. She has a phone within the camp, and she texts me, and one of these cold messages changed my feelings completely about her. I mean, she lost 3 children, and on one of the second interviews, she showed me a picture, a kind of a happy family scene with a baby with chocolate around its face, and I felt really sad. I knew what the outcome of this child was, and I was quite tearful. I thought it was really such a sad situation. So when I got home, I sent her a message and said, look, Shamima, I'm really, really sorry. It made me really sad seeing a picture of your child. And she said, well, don't worry, I'm over that part of my life now. It doesn't bother me anymore. I found that very cold.
So, Rebecca, we were hearing there that Shamima Begum no longer has a citizenship. She was a British citizen. She now is no longer, because, of course, that has been revoked or pulled away from her. Now, one of the justifications the British government gave for that was that she had the potential for dual nationality and could therefore not be described as a stateless person because she could become Bangladeshi. So does that mean she's now Bangladeshi then?
Well, her lawyers didn't actually contest that at the time in January 2019, when the Home Secretary made that decision. In the recent SIAC case, her lawyers didn't contest that she did have the right to Bangladeshi citizenship. And Yasmine has just touched on that. And what I see as potentially the most critical part of this case that could lead to a political reversal of thought. I can't see that it's a legal reversal of thought, but politically it may be seen that what I think Yasmine said, cruelty of depriving this girl of a citizenship and leaving her effectively stateless, while that is technically wrong, politically that might be a motivation to reconsider this case. However, she does, or did, certainly when the decision was made, she did have a right to Bangladeshi citizenship because she is entitled to that up until the age of 21. She chose not to exercise it, but she now is in a position, and the court acknowledged this, that she can't exercise rights of that citizenship anyway because her prospects of going to Bangladesh are as remote as her prospects as coming back to the UK. So while I can see the legal justification, and I would support the legal justification for the Home Secretary's decision, I am sympathetic to what Yasmine says, because the way I look at it as a human being is that girl is stateless and she's in a camp where nobody's going to make any effort to ameliorate her situation or even repatriate her, whether that's to Bangladesh or the UK. Arguably, she might get into Holland because she has a husband there.
Now, Yasmine, Shamima Begum is hardly the only stateless person in the world. There are plenty of them. What exactly happens in the situation? How does one end up without a country of origin, as it were?
Well, essentially, I mean, certainly in this situation, it's a situation whereby that she's been deprived of her citizenship. Now, under international law, it's unlawful to deprive someone of their citizenship unless they are entitled to another citizenship, and that's essentially what the UK courts, the Supreme Court, has found in the UK. And as the previous speaker has mentioned, she was eligible for a Bangladeshi citizenship at the time of the deprivation decision. However, that was in effect a kind of not really realistic. Bangladesh has said that they will not take her back. She has no connection with Bangladesh, and now that, in fact, time frame from doing that has expired. But according to the law, according to the Supreme Court, that is possible. And it's a question, as previously mentioned, whether the government thinks that's palatable to leave a girl who we know, and I think it's really important in this situation to highlight that it's not just human rights organisations, it's not just the public, but the court, the commission itself said that there's a credible suspicion that she was groomed and trafficked as a minor. And the fact that in other situations in the UK, we will perceive individuals, and rightly so, who are subject to this as victims, and we will treat them accordingly. That's not saying that anyone gets a free pass. And in fact, if there are crimes that there is evidence that she has committed, then I don't think that anyone would say, don't bring her back. And adequately subject her to the criminal justice system or other measures as may be appropriate. But the fact of just leaving her there, now being stateless, I think is really one of the most concerning aspects of the case, because as has been rightly noted, it means that you don't have access to all the other rights that an individual that has nationality has. And in this situation, what the UK and other governments now who are changing their position have done is essentially outsourced their security situation, like they had done in Guantanamo, left people in a legal black hole, indefinitely detained, and washed their hands of them. Now, Shamima Begum is one individual who's been left stateless as a result of this, but states thankfully now are starting to resume or starting to repatriate individuals, but the UK government have been an outlier in refusing to repatriate any of its nationals, and also obviously pursuing this deprivation decision, citizenship deprivation decision of Shamima Begum.
Andrew, when you interviewed her over all that time, what indication did Shamima Begum give you of how she felt about the prospect of being stateless? I would imagine most people, regardless of what nationality they are, if you said to them, well, you're going to be disowned by the nation you were born in or the nation you were brought up in, would be very concerned by that prospect.
Well, she is, and she doesn't think she'll ever come back. One thing I must agree with, I feel uncomfortable with her citizenship being taken away from her. It's a different subject of whether I think she's guilty of carrying out atrocities when she was there, which I kind of think there's a possibility she did carry out some, but I don't think her citizenship should have been taken away from her. She was born in this country and we have to deal with it in that way. I was there when an appeal got turned down, or she just had an appeal got down, or someone did, over a year ago, and she said she felt suicidal. So I think that she would most definitely be suicidal now, because the prospects are so grim for her. I don't think she's been a good way at the moment.
Rebecca, if we have a look at some of the numbers on this, it would be very tempting to think that this was a situation whereby the Home Secretary in the United Kingdom has said, no, I'm going to revoke citizenship from person X. And this was in some ways a nuclear option, something that happened very, very rarely. The Home Office didn't actually respond to our calls for official numbers on this, but there are numbers available from people who have gone out and performed large numbers of freedom of information requests and put together figures for themselves. And the kinds of figures that we're looking at here show at least 464 people who've been stripped of their British citizenship since the law allowing it was relaxed around 15 years ago. And they've been deprived for a variety of different reasons. Obviously, a large number of them on national security grounds, but many of them on the grounds of fraud, which seems a much, much lower level. So do we have any indications of how these powers are being used, under what circumstances the Home Secretary intervenes and says, this person's acts have been so horrible, they are no longer British?
Well, the Home Secretary has been given those powers by democratic mandate. So those are powers that Parliament has conferred. And I think Yasmine would agree with me that the wording of that discretionary power is extremely broad and non-specific. Now, Yasmine did bring up the issue of trafficking, but that is not specifically mentioned in any statutory checklist that the Home Secretary...
There's nothing in there to take account of woollier areas like Stockholm Syndrome. Somebody is kidnapped and they're brainwashed until they feel sympathy for their captors.
Well, you know, nobody is saying that the Home Secretary didn't consider that either. You know, obviously the Home Secretary hasn't been asked, but in the round, the evidence that the Home Secretary considered in 2019 was her age at the time she was trafficked, the fact that she had by then had 4 years within Raqqa, which was in the Caliphate at the time. And then all of the information that we will never see, which is the closed information on the SIAC, and that is security service information. We will never know the full remit of available evidence to the Home Secretary when the decision was made. It has to be conducive to the public good, not to Shamima Begum's good. It has to be conducive to the public good. I would just like to add that what drives the Home Secretary's power is policy. And policy is not a rule of law. And SIAC and the Supreme Court made that very, very clear. You might not like the policy, but the Court of Appeals sort of thought they could go in and replace their views on the Home Secretary. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You're not being asked to consider the facts here. Simply was the Home Secretary outside of his powers. And so when you ask questions about 465 other individuals, we don't know what the policy was at the time. We don't know what the security implications were at the time. And I think you can, and your viewers could reasonably assume that that policy changes. And one of the policies, and I am being speculative here, but I can see Yasmine nodding in the background, one of the policies may well be deterrence to prevent this fairly frightening stream of people illegally entering the caliphate before it collapsed, and then when it collapsed, seeking to return and to exercise their citizenship rights. Then the policy has to be, we have to prevent this in the future.
I'm going to come back to you in a moment because I want to talk about the powers of revocation of passports and freedom to travel as well. But first, Yasmine, you were nodding during that. Tell us your thoughts.
You know, look, I wholly agree. I mean, as I stated at the beginning, I think the Commission had their hands tied by virtue of the decision of the Supreme Court and the way that the powers are laid out. But I think what's really interesting is how in the judgment, the Commission, you really feel it when you read the judgment, that the commissioners themselves were really grappling with this issue. I haven't really read a SIAC decision, this is the Commission's decision, where I felt it so evidently that was the case. They were grappling deeply with the idea that she was 15 years old, she was groomed and trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. The UK government, and they said this in a number of times in the judgment, failed to prevent her leaving, failed to detect her grooming. There were a number of steps that were failed when she was a minor, and they went out explicitly, and they in fact said it was open now for there to be an investigation into the failures. But I see in that judgment that the commissioners did also feel very, very tied by what they could and couldn't do. And it certainly seems to me now that the decision, it is a political decision now, and it's certainly a decision now that the Home Secretary needs to reevaluate this case in light of the fact that it is clear that there's a reasonable suspicion, and I think even it could be put higher than that, and the UK government that she was trafficked for sexual exploitation. And I think also it's very important to note that someone in the situation of Shamima Begum, she has become the poster girl for a very, very worrying phenomenon, but also for a very knee-jerk reaction of governments in response to it. And she has been the spotlight of this issue. And I don't think it is by any means extraordinary or unexpected that she would act in a manner that someone who is traumatized and been through trauma as a child would respond. So I think when we assess and respond her and assess her behaviour, I think we really do need to take that into account to what she's faced. She's had 3 children that have died. She was likely groomed and trafficked as a child for sexual exploitation. And she's been through, and no doubt there is likely some very serious questions about what she was involved in. But I think that all needs to be really seen in the round, and also in the context that the UK government has the ability to deal with the situation of people returning. We've had many people from Iraq and Syria that have returned. In fact, the Home Office themselves has noted that a number of people have returned. And at the time, I think it was 2019 or 18, they actually stated that there was no security risk for many of those that have returned. And so I think there is ways to manage this. And this case really needs to be seen for what it is. And certainly the Home Secretary should be reviewing the decision.
Andrew, you've met her. Do you feel that she was trafficked? What do you make of the possibility that she suffered Stockholm syndrome, that she was groomed, that she was brainwashed into the position that she was in?
I listened to that conversation then and kind of with open mouth. I don't think she was groomed or trafficked at all. There was another girl there. We all see the three girls, but the fourth girl, there was a fourth girl that she spoke to. We heard about these videos, and I asked her whether she had watched any of these ISIS videos. It was only until the recent documentary that it's the first time I've heard of it. We said she was groomed for sexual reasons. She was in love with her husband. She told me scenes of enjoyment, sitting down watching TV. And also, I think we forget about the victims as well. When I listen to everybody talking about Shamima and what's happened to her, and she was 15 and everything else, we tend to forget that there's good possibilities, as we talk about possibilities of being trafficked, that she might have been part of the Hezbollah police. And equally, she might have been involved in suicide vests. These are more than just rumours that are spilled about. These are locals' information. I've travelled inside Raqqa. I spent a lot of time with her. I actually, at one point, thought that she was never going to be capable of doing these things. But I actually clearly think she has. And I think we have to individually look at Shamima before we make a wide, sweeping statement just due to her age.
Would you like to see the Home Secretary's decision overturned at some stage in the future in the appeals process based on what you now know? Or do you think that, in your opinion, he made, if not the right decision, certainly a valid decision?
I think the decision was valid. I think it's a difficult one because I don't agree with your citizenship being taken away from you. She was born in Britain, I mean the dual citizenship, and I feel uncomfortable for a precedent it sets for the future. I really, I'm torn between the two because I know that Shamima, I know, certainly needs punishing. I think punishing at home would be, I think, my preferable way, but I think even if she gets her citizenship back, we can't be confused. The SDF could send her to trial there and she could be charged, she could do 20 years.
Certainly. Rebecca, if I can just bring it back to you. I mentioned earlier there is an issue within the UK. Most people imagine that if you're a British person, you can get up and you can head anywhere you like. But the fact of the matter is you can revoke the travel rights of anyone.
Yes, so suspending your rights to exercise citizenship is actually temporally quite different to revocation of citizenship. It's almost a different thing altogether because there are a lot of people in the UK at the moment who are under prevention of terrorism restrictions and curfews, and they are also not allowed foreign travel, and indeed many criminals are prevented from foreign travel. Just one thing that Andrew brought up about his own personal views on the matter, you know, I see a lot of commentary, a lot of very angry commentary about Shamima Begum.
On both
sides. And actually, justice is not a one-way street. Justice has to be done on both sides. And this was dealt with by both the Supreme Court and SIAC in the most recent case, that it was looked at whether her Article 4 rights, which again have been referred to, which is protection from slavery and the trafficking aspect of her case, was dealt with. Yes, indeed, they found that it was credible that she had been trafficked, and I don't think anybody would pull back from that. And Andrew says, well, effectively she had agency. Well, a lot of people who deal with victims would say that that agency is compromised if you have been trafficked to, or you are the sort of person who would be trafficked.
And also, if you're under 16 as well, where you draw the line of majority, whether it's 16, 18 or 21, she was still 15. She falls below most of those thresholds.
Yes, but under our jurisprudence, you can actually have Gillick competence. So you can have agency, and certainly in the UK...
Over the age of 10 in the UK.
Well, the criminal responsibility arises at 10, but, Gillick responsibility, the ability to consent to medical procedures that, say, your parents don't consent to, that exists based on a subjective judgment per person. So at 15, it's really best not to blur those lines because she's under the sexual age of consent, But in this country, at 12, a lot of politicians would say that a 12-year-old can choose what gender they are. And so it is a mixed bag of where agency lies. But that was dealt with in SIAC, and that was dealt with by her lawyers. Very, very credible arguments put forward. To what extent you mitigate the national security threat by the other facts of the case. And the court said, you cannot do that. We're not balancing facts. We are simply looking to see on a judicial review basis whether the Home Secretary exceeded his powers, and he didn't. He is in possession of a huge volume, which SIAC referred to, a huge volume of closed information, which we will never, ever see.
Rebecca, thank you very much. Andrew, Yasmine, an absolute pleasure to have you on the show as well. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head on over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching. Goodbye.